He stared at the notice. His property rights were suspended over a door color. Then came the fines, the liens, the threats. The HOA owned him, but when he uncovered their darkest secret, the entire neighborhood turned against them. And what happened next? No one saw it coming. Michael stormed out of the HOA office, his pulse hammering in his ears. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't a fine. This was outright theft. His property, his home, stripped from him over something as ridiculous as a door color. He pulled out the HOA agreement, flipping through the pages, searching for the clause Richard had so smugly referenced. There it was, buried under convoluted legal jargon, tucked between ambiguous subpoints, the HOA's power to suspend rights for non-compliance. The wording was vague, deliberately so. There was no clear limit on what they could do or how long these suspensions could last. Michael clenched his jaw. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood uniform. It was about power. Richard and his HOA board had spent years tightening their grip, slapping homeowners with arbitrary fines, penalizing them for the smallest infractions, threatening legal action over mailboxes an inch too tall or driveways with a single crack. Most people just paid up. The hassle of fighting back wasn't worth the time or money. That's exactly what they were counting on. Michael wasn't going to be another silent victim. He had worked too hard for this house. He wouldn't let a group of wannabe dictators dictate what he could do with his own property. But as he researched his options, his frustration deepened. Lawyers were hesitant. The contract, while unethical, was technically legal. The state's homeowner laws leaned heavily in favor of HOAs, leaving residents like him with little recourse. The best advice he got? Just comply. Repaint the door. It's easier. Michael refused. He knocked on his neighbor's door, then another. He knew he wasn't the only one fed up. But every conversation ended the same way. A hushed warning, a reluctant shake of the head. You don't want to push them. They'll make your life hell. They already had. And Michael was done playing by their rules. What he didn't know was that the HOA had only just begun their retaliation. Part 2. The cost of corruption. Pain. Michael sat across from the attorney, gripping the armrests of his chair. The verdict was clear. The HOA had him cornered. The lawyer's words echoed in his head. Legally, they have the upper hand. Michael had signed that contract like everyone else, trusting that it was just a formality. But the HOA had buried their power deep in legal jargon, making sure no homeowner truly understood what they were agreeing to. This wasn't about maintaining the neighborhood. This was a business, and they were running it like a mob. The sinking feeling in his stomach only worsened as he recalled the stories he had heard. Stories he once thought were exaggerations. A retired couple forced to sell after mysterious violations drained their savings. A single mother evicted after racking up thousands in fines for excessive noise complaints she swore never happened. Neighbors who once fought back, only to give up and move away. Now they were coming for him. The first blow landed fast. A lien appeared on his home for unpaid penalties. Penalties he hadn't even been informed of. His access to community amenities was revoked. The pool, the gym, the clubhouse, gone. Then came the harassment. One morning, he woke to a violation notice on his door. His lawn was non-compliant. It was neatly trimmed, flawless, but the HOA claimed it was 0.5 inches taller than regulation height. A week later, a letter arrived demanding $500 in fines. It didn't stop there. His mailbox was suddenly the wrong style. His trash bins weren't properly placed. HOA board members walked past his home with smug glances. And Richard? Richard made it personal. At a community meeting, Richard stood in front of dozens of homeowners, smirking as he spoke. Some people think they're above the rules. They refuse to cooperate, and instead of fixing the problem, they'd rather whine about it. We all know who I'm talking about.
The room was silent. Neighbors avoided Michael's gaze. No one stood up for him. Michael clenched his fists. Was this fight even winnable? Then his phone buzzed. A message. They did this to me too. I have proof. Meet me at the diner.
Michael walked into the dimly lit diner, scanning the room. In the far corner, Sarah Phillips sat with a worn manila folder in front of her, fingers tapping anxiously against the table. He slid into the seat across from her, his heart pounding. Without a word, she pushed the folder toward him. Bank records, internal emails, she murmured. Richard and his cronies have been pocketing HOA funds for years. Michael flipped it open, his breath hitching. Unauthorized transfers, inflated vendor contracts, fake expense reports. The evidence was overwhelming. The HOA wasn't just abusing its power, it was running a full-blown financial scam. Sarah exhaled sharply. They forced me out over noise complaints that never existed. I had no choice but to sell. Michael clenched his jaw. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. This was bigger. Richard had ruined lives, and now it was time to ruin him. Michael wasted no time. He hired a real attorney, one who specialized in HOA fraud. The lawsuit was filed, and the moment it hit the public record, he took the story online. Social media exploded. HOA president caught stealing funds, residents speak out. Corrupt HOA exposed, homeowners fighting back. News stations picked up the story. More residents came forward, dozens of them, each with their own horror story. HOA fines, forced evictions, unexplained fees, all traced back to Richard's board. The once untouchable HOA was drowning in allegations. Richard panicked. Cease and desist letters arrived within days. A weak attempt to silence Michael, but it was too late. The entire community had turned against him. And then came the court date. Michael sat across from Richard in the packed courtroom, his pulse steady. The judge skimmed the financial records, brow furrowing. Richard shifted in his seat, his confidence gone. The court finds the Pinecrest Meadows HOA guilty of fraudulent practices, financial misconduct, and unlawful property rights suspensions. The judge's voice was firm. All liens, fines, and restrictions are nullified immediately. Richard's face drained of color. Michael finally exhaled. He had won. The verdict sent ripples through Pinecrest Meadows like an earthquake, shaking the very foundation of the corrupt HOA regime. Within days, the fallout began. The board was dismantled, Richard was officially under investigation, and the bylaws that had given the HOA unchecked power were being rewritten from the ground up. For the first time in years, homeowners weren't afraid to speak. The same people who had once whispered in hushed tones now openly celebrated the downfall of those who had ruled with intimidation and greed. The HOA office, once a place of fear and frustration, stood eerily empty, its doors locked, its influence shattered. Michael watched as crews removed the absurd violation notices from front doors. The liens that had threatened families were wiped clean, and the unfair fees vanished. People who had been forced into silence now had a voice, and that voice was loud. Richard, once untouchable, was nowhere to be seen. His smirk, his arrogance, his sense of invincibility, all gone. The last anyone heard, he was scrambling for a lawyer of his own, trying to salvage what was left of his reputation. But the damage was done. The people he had bullied for years now controlled his fate. Michael stood in front of his house, staring at the freshly painted navy blue door. It wasn't just a door anymore. It was a statement. A middle finger to the tyranny that had nearly stolen his home. It was proof that no HOA, no corrupt leader, no fraudulent system could take away what rightfully belonged to him. A small crowd had gathered. Neighbors who had once avoided his gaze now approached with gratitude in their eyes. It was home. And this time, It belonged to the homeowners.